Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Geektown Behind The Scenes podcast. I'm your host Dave Elliott, and on this episode I'm chatting with Nico del Giudice of Molecule VFX, who has recently been working as VFX Supervisor on the show Dr. Death, which is currently airing on Starzplay in the UK and on Peacock in the USA. Based on the podcast of the same name, Dr. Death is inspired by the true story of Dr. Christopher Duntsch, played in the show by Joshua Jackson, a rising star in the Dallas medical community who was building a flourishing neurosurgery practice when everything suddenly changed. Patients entered his operating room for complex but routine spinal surgeries, but left permanently maimed or dead. As the victims piled up, two fellow surgeons, neurosurgeons Robert Henderson, played by Alec Baldwin, and vascular surgeon Randall Kirby, played by Christian Slater, as well as Dallas prosecutor Michelle Shughart, played by AnnaSophia Robb, set out to stop him. You'd expect with a show like this that most of the VFX work would be recreating and emphasizing the horror aspect of the doctor's grisly operations. However, due to the scheduling changes caused by the global pandemic, a lot of Molecule's work shifted to having to do things like alter seasons, greening trees, and over 170 other invisible blended effect shots. Along with Nico's work on Dr. Death, in the interview we also chat about some of his other projects. This includes the wonderfully bonkers adaptation of Grant Morrison's comic book Happy, which features the titular cartoon Blue Unicorn, the superb Billions starring Damian Lewis and Paul Giamatti, CBS's Elementary, and the Apple TV Plus Sesame Workshop series Helpsters. If you'd like to hear more behind-the-scenes interviews, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts by searching for Geektown Radio. This will also give you our weekly Geektown Radio podcast, which brings you all the latest TV, film, and gaming news. You can also go to the website at geektown.co.uk for daily news stories and all the latest UK and US TV premiere dates. Here's the interview with Nico del Giudice of Molecule VFX. Thank you for spending some time to come on and talk about some of your work, particularly Dr. Death, which is the new show you're working on, which weirdly is going out on Starzplay over here, although they've just announced that we're getting Peacock. But it's not going to air on Peacock over here. It's going to air on Starzplay.
Oh, wow.
Before we get into the actual show, do you just want to give a little background of how you got into VFX work in the first place?
Yeah, sure. I always knew that I wanted to get into like media-based arts. Ever since I was a kid, I was wanting to get into like video games or movies or TV or something like that. I had a background in studio art and then went to school of visual arts for visual effects, computer animation. And then I made a thesis film, and my professor at the time owned the Molecule and still does, and hired me after I graduated, and been there ever since. It's been 6 years.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So straight out of school into, awesome. Dr. Death is the thing you've been working on most recently as VFX Supervisor. I know, obviously, I've seen the trailer. I know a bit of background about the show. So presumably you're working on a lot of medical shots. And how are you approaching that? Because I know, given that it's about this guy who's essentially a serial killer, I guess,
right.
You're pushing a bit more of the sort of gore and horror aspect rather than just like you would in something like a medical drama.
Yeah, I mean, going into it, I expected a lot of like blood enhancement and wound cleanup and whatnot. Surprisingly, that wasn't the majority of the work that we did. The majority of the work that we did was like location enhancements, because the pandemic had kind of shifted around schedule. We had to do like a lot of greening work, a lot of CG trees. There was like mainly a location where we shot in like New Mexico, and it was, it's like a desert there. So we had to make it look like Texas in July.
Wow.
And it had to look like a suburban sprawl. Yeah. So it's funny. Yeah. Because I went into it thinking that we were going to end up doing like a lot of gore stuff, especially coming from the last project that I worked on with the showrunner, Patrick McManus. It was Happy, just a ton of action gore, a little wacky. But yeah, we did some prosthetic cleanups, and we also did like some blood that's like splattered out on the floor. But yeah, the majority of our work, I'd say, was like greening work.
Right. Okay. So how do you go about changing a season like that. And, I mean, you said the pandemic kind of shifted stuff around. So, I mean, presumably you got all this stuff planned out and then the pandemic hit and you're like, oh crap, we're going to have to like shuffle everything around. So what's the sort of process you go through for changing seasons like that?
It's like something that they didn't anticipate entirely. So, I found myself on set for certain days that there was just, hey, we have tons of trees in the background for this. We didn't expect this whatsoever. But, it's like the leaves are now changing from green to fall or autumn leaves, or, hey, now we have no leaves at all. How are we going to put leaves on these trees? So our team at Molecule has built out like a library of CG trees. And we basically just, we have some assets where we chop the trunks off of, or we have like specific CG branches and whatnot, and we'll track a shot in CG and then place the branches here and there. You try to prevent as much as you can with crossing on set, like foreground actors crossing the background.
Yeah.
But it's just one of those things where it's like, we have to shoot in the time frame that we have. And it's unfortunate that it happens in fall or winter, but we just have to use the best methods to get the shots to be looking like summer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a crazy, just the way the schedules fall. So, I mean, as well as doing sort of things like changing seasons, presumably set extensions and that sort of stuff are a major part of what you're doing. What sort of stuff were you doing on that side of things?
There's two major scenes that we worked on. One is the Texas Neurosurgical Institute. It's like in the Dallas suburbs. That's what I was saying was shot in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. So as far as set extensions, we had to make it look like a giant suburban sprawl where there's just like tons and tons of houses that just look similar, like you're living in the suburbs. But, for our backgrounds, it was a lot of like foreground actors crossing desert, which required a lot of roto, and then just using multiple matte paintings for different angles, planning out specifically like the plot of land that we were shooting in, knowing the eastern direction, southern direction, seeing the Dallas skyline in there, making sure we had the continuity between all shots and multiple artists. And it was spread of like between 3 or 4 episodes, pretty sure. So, when you're working on something like a set build as big as that, and you have these tight turnarounds, you have to ensure that you have the same consistency between multiple episodes, multiple artists, multiple shots. That was a big set extension piece that we did. And then another one that we did Denver Airport, which if you look it up, it has like these tents atop the airport. It's like a very specific style and a very specific, like people that see that airport, it's very memorable. Mm-hmm. We shot Queens College and we had to put the CG tents above Queens College and make it look like it was Denver. We had to like green all the trees, and I mean, it's a huge set extension, but I think it was pretty convincing in the end.
Yeah. Wow. What would you say is the most complicated shot you ended up having to do on the show?
I'd say the TNI stuff. Yeah. The New Mexico set extensions. We did some prosthetic enhancement for like a neck wound. That was pretty difficult just because the prosthetic that was on there wasn't fully believable, but it required like, just a bunch of cleanup around it with like a moving camera. But I'd say, probably the most complex shot was the TNI sequence.
Mm. When it comes to doing that sort of gorier stuff, do you have references for that sort of thing? Or is it books of like really horrible wounds and stuff?
Right. Yeah. I mean, like when we were back in the office setting, you'd be walking by like people's monitors and you'd see just disgusting images of stuff. Be like, what are we doing? But I mean, like with anything in visual effects, you kind of just want to match the reality. If you're not matching references, then you're kind of just making things up in your own head. And obviously that's not going to be conveyed to the audience in the same way that you see it. So, like with the airport, we were looking at exact references of the tents, as far as lighting and whatnot too, for the gore stuff. Yeah. Like how fast does blood spill out when it's leaking on the floor? It's like the viscosity of it and like thickness of blood versus water. We had some syringes that, we had to make like the watery consistency of the blood that we use practically look more viscous and thick blood. So, it's like you're always looking at references just to make sure that we're on the same page and it looks like the real world. Yeah,
those subtle little things I love. Yeah, because if you're doing a big superhero like action thing, there's effects in it, but there's effects in it. You can clearly see them because superheroes don't exist. Right. I love things like that when you're kind of, the stuff that you don't notice. It's great.
Exactly. I got into visual effects thinking, hey, man, it's like we're going to make Guardians of the Galaxy or we're going to make these Marvel movies and shows. And yeah, sure, that is a genre of visual effects, but I think a really challenging genre of visual effects is the stuff that you're trying to not see. the stuff that just the audience will never know that it happened. And I think that if you can achieve that, it's a really successful accomplishment on your part and your team's part. And it's different because, when I was working on Happy with Patrick and Brian Taylor, it was more in your face visual effects. You have CG characters, you have, these imaginary friends flying around, and, the audience is watching it being like, oh my God, he is tripping and he is like, or he has imaginary friends. Like, these are blatant visual effects. Whereas Dr. Death, it was a completely different approach, trying to tell the world of Christopher Duntsch in the real sense, with visual effects that just aid the story as opposed to being the story. Mm-hmm. So I like the genre of visual effects where you can't notice it.
Yeah, no, I love that sort of thing. I mean, when a lot of the visual effects companies will post background videos up on YouTube, but I love watching the ones where there shows where you don't think there's that many visual effects until you actually go and see it, what they've done to it, and you're like, oh my God.
Yeah, you see them wipe through with the breakdowns and it's just like...
Yeah, it's just crazy. You mentioned Happy there, which was a phenomenal fun series, and as something which one of my co-hosts on the main podcast show, he's a huge fan of the comic books as well, and I was like, how are they going to do that?
Right, the Grant Morrison comic book's so great.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal book as well. What was your involvement on that show? Were you involved in creating Happy himself, or was it the sort of surrounding stuff?
For Happy, I joined on the pilot as on-set supervisor, and then continued. It's such a massive show with visual effects that it's a multi-vendor show. Yeah. Happy specifically, as well as the CG characters, were handled by another studio called Axis. And then the other visual effects like fire, gunshots, wounds, and whatnot was handled by Molecule. I mean, there's a bunch of vendors on it, but as far as like on-set supervision and being there every day with the show and being on set, I was there for all of it. You have to basically get references for every take of where you have CG characters in the shot. And Happy was the number 2. Maloney was the number 1. So, he made it into a lot of shots, and there's a lot of stuff you can imagine just as far as set extensions, and it felt like every other shot was a VFX shot at times. But, definitely the type of job that kickstarts you into a really intense amount of visual effects. So for me at that time, it was like I was just thrown into this really heavy, saturated world of visual effects, and I learned a lot from it.
Yeah. Dealing with a character, well, any sort of CGI character, but I mean, specifically something like Happy as the on-set supervisor, what are they actually acting to? Is it the sort of tennis ball on stick thing with that, or is it like nothing there? Or...
It's funny you should ask. In the beginning, it was really poor man style, where I kind of had I had my chrome ball and I had my diffuse ball just for lighting reference. But then I also had like a prop puppet, going into the show. Yeah, it was like something I picked up at Toys R Us. But I knew exactly what I came from knowing the bare, like I knew what I needed, but I didn't necessarily have the 3D printed model at that point. Yeah. So in the later seasons, we got like a 3D printed model that was like painted a gray, diffuse, and that's great for lighting reference. But you need something there on set for people to see, and just obviously for the artist to have as like a good reference for lighting and shot composition and whatnot. But as the show went on, I think Chris Maloney has like an amazing imagination, and his response to camera cues and everything is he has his whole world basically built out, and he understands, where Happy is, where Happy was. So I think we got into a groove as time went on, where the doll became less of a influence, but yeah, you still try to get in there every shot and just, get the elements that you need for the artist in the end. Just run and hold up the doll and then, set up the shot.
Yeah. I always think that must be a really tough gig for an actor to basically working towards nothing. That's got to be quite a hard job for them, I would have thought.
Right. I know it's kind of like his character in the show is very like delirious and crazy as it is. So you kind of get away with like, if something doesn't line up or if he's looking like, around, there's some forgiveness in there. But especially for a lot of directors that came onto the show, it's like, there aren't many shows that have been done like that. So it's like a learning experience for everybody. And you definitely still have to follow the rules and the physics of eye lines and whatnot. But you're just doing so with a ridiculous looking puppet on set. So it's a challenge, but it's a fun one, know?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the other shows you've worked on, Billions, I noticed you worked on, I guess a lot of that is sort of set extensions and that sort of more invisible stuff or something like that. Yeah.
Right.
Are there anything surprising that you worked on that show that people might be kind of shocked that there was a VFX shot in there?
Yeah. So it's funny because I'm working on Billions now. It's back. And, they were stopped in season 5 due to the pandemic, but there were some scenes in the season that I feel like people wouldn't notice. There's visual effects, as you're saying. We shot up in Mohonk Mountain, and there's a scene where Axe is watching like a seaplane land on the lake, but you can't actually, land at that location.
Right.
So we had to put in a CG seaplane for that. And I think my favorite shot of that sequence is we needed to get like the landing where the seaplane hits the water. You're seeing the water spray up. So what we did was we shot an actual seaplane on the East River here in Manhattan. And and then I shot plates up at Mohonk Mountain of the background. We rotoed out the seaplane in the water, and then we just tracked the back plates that I'd shot in Mohonk. You have to light it up like the same way, get it same time of day, hopefully, so that the lighting interaction works and everything. And then we just comped the background plates into the landing. If you look at it, you would see like Queens in the background, but we switched it out to be Mohonk.
Nice. I noticed one of the other shows that was on your list of things, Helpsters, the Apple and Sesame Workshop show. I mean, that's obviously mainly a puppet show. So what sort of stuff were you doing on that for them?
Right. Helpsters is such a great show for Molecule and just, for me personally, because we're not killing people in it and, has a really positive impact on the world, I think. So, I mean, that fulfillment is amazing in and of itself. It's a good step away from the other mediums that we're working in. But my involvement in Helpsters was Sesame Street has always taken the approach where if you have a small puppet like Elmo, if you have like, any smaller puppets, they're usually being operated from under like a set piece that conceals the puppeteer. With Helpsters, it's kind of like this new age telling of Sesame Street with new characters and, like Cody, the main character, is like introducing the concept of looping and, certain themes in modern day youth that when we were kids, like we didn't think about like with technology and whatnot. So they're trying to introduce like this new age of Sesame Street. And by doing so, they also wanted to include like full body small puppets. Right. So Cody, instead of just being fully operated from under a set piece, as well as Mr. Prim, there's puppeteers in green jumpsuits.
I see.
It's hilarious on set. But, and they're operating these puppets, and then we have to key out the puppeteers in the green suits, which helps, but there's always roto involved with that. And then we're replacing the background. So like in the show opener, Cody like hops up from behind the desk and she starts dancing on the table. That was like full green screen bodysuit puppeteers, and the back plate was the other Helpsters like dancing. So there was a lot of that. There were some select shots where we had to do like a CG rocket as well as like a CG water tower. We did like a full music video with Neo, the R&B singer, which was a highlight for me. I always loved Neo. So we did like full green screen with that. It was really cool. Yeah, it's not a show where we have consistent visual effects throughout every episode, but we have specific highlighted shots that are really cool, really unique. And as always, like the message of the show is the most important thing. And it's a great show to work on. Yeah.
And like you say, it's a really interesting change of pace from like, the usual stuff you'd be doing, which is lovely. You get to do that.
Right. Breath of fresh air.
Yeah. Out of all the stuff you've worked on over the years, is there one particular shot that really stands out to you that was either very difficult or interesting to work on, or something that you were really, really pleased with at the end?
Yeah, definitely one that stands out to me is on Elementary with Johnny Lee Miller and Lucy Liu.
I love that show, yeah.
There was a shot where, and you're in the UK right now, but we had to sell New York as London. So what we had said is, production doesn't want to send like an entire crew to the UK sometimes. It's a huge cost to do so. Yeah. So what we did was we shot the scene in New York, and it happened to be rainy. And I was like, oh my God, this is perfect.
Yes.
If it's overcast or raining, this is amazing. Because I know that when we go to London, the chances of it being sunny are slim. Yes. And it was like during spring too. So I was like, okay, perfect. But it's basically Johnny and Lucy are at a brownstone style like stoop, and then they walk off into like a crane crane shot that rises up and you see them walking out into the sunset, quote unquote, type of thing. But, we have like the New York City taxi cabs and city bikes and whatnot in the shot. So what we had to do is we had to send like a VFX splinter unit out to London. So I went out there and then we got a crane, same camera setup. It wasn't a motion control shot, but we basically reenacted the shot as close as possible and then shot a ton of plates. And then for the final, we basically 3D tracked both shots and then lined them up in a way where we projected from the cameras onto some 3D geo and pieced it together with some CG vehicles and different bikes, obviously. I think we threw in the telly booths in there just for the iconic London look. But, that shot was just a really surreal time of my life, just because you're going to a different country for a single scene or a single shot. Yeah. And the way that it came out in the end, it was like everybody had rest assured by the end of it, just because it came out great. I actually want to rewatch that shot now that I'm talking about it. But, there's just certain shots in your life that you're like, oh man, like I'll forever remember this. And that is definitely one.
Yeah, I think I remembered the shots you're talking about, actually, and you wouldn't have known at all. I mean, really, really solid work. It's, and I love that show as well. It was fantastic. So moving on to the last few questions. Anything else you'd like to mention in terms of stuff you're working on at the moment?
I don't think I could say anything about what I'm working on. I'm not even sure if I could have said I'm working on Billions, but
we know it's coming back. I think you're okay with that. I know they're filming it again, so you're fine with that, I think.
I don't think there's anything. I mean, there are reoccurring seasons that we're working on at Molecule. Specifically for me as a visual effects supervisor, I have a couple things coming up, but more so like the stuff that if I hop into like CG or if I work as a CG artist, like we're working on some projects that, are just reoccurring seasons for us. If you look at the Molecules roster of shows that we've been working on, a lot of them are just seasons that are coming back and reoccurring. So just
as a sort of side to that, obviously with everything shooting at the moment and dealing with the pandemic on top of that, you mentioned the pandemic changing things for the shooting of Dr. Death. Is that been continuing on through other shows that are coming back right now where you're having,
definitely,
to, I don't know, remove probably not masks off people, but, that sort of things that have cropped up from the pandemic that you're having to deal with?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's like two pieces of it. It's like, one, people are running out of things to watch. So you feel like shows are like the demand for new content is just super heavy. So you're inevitably busy from that. Yeah. But then on top of that, it's like, hey, we're shooting in seasons that don't work with the script, but what are we going to do? We have to do it either way. It's kind of like the scenario of Dr. Death. So essentially we've become CG farmers in a sense, in compositing farmers, with the amount of like greening that we've done, which we joke about. But there's a lot of stuff that like comes up with just greening in general in set extensions, which is fun. I mean, tree shots, there's an art to them. Obviously, if you have no leaves on a tree, it's not like you could just color correct the existing leaves that are brown and turn them green. It's not just like a compositing color-based grading technique. When you're working with like CG trees and different types of trees and leaves and whatnot, you have to have like a specific branch build out or a tree build out. And, there's like an art form to it, but, anything in excess, you're kind of like, okay, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? But that definitely doesn't take away from like the love of the art of greening in a sense.
Yeah, I guess at one point there was sort of, I'd seen CG show reels of VFX companies talking about kind of moving people closer together, because not when they were first starting the pandemic stuff, they'd had to shoot with like people slightly further apart than they needed, and that sort of stuff.
Right. Yeah. No, I feel like, because there's like different zones now and there's so many COVID like regulations in place. Set life now is far different from when it was back in January. In January, it felt like, oh my God, are we supposed to be doing this? Mm-hmm. Whereas now it's like the protocol is so tight between PCR and rapid tests and then just people being vaccinated as well. It's like, it's far more relaxed, I guess you'd say, even though the regulations are tight.
Yeah. So last couple of questions for you. Sure. Firstly, what TV shows are you watching at the moment?
So it's funny because I haven't really had much time to get into any new shows, but one of them recently that I feel like I should have been on, but haven't been on is Peaky Blinders.
Yeah.
And it's a time period piece from what I've seen. And, coming back from London to it, like makes me really want to like watch it. I'm in that UK mode. But I mean, I love set extension stuff. So I feel like I have to get into that show. I feel like they're trying to, as we're saying, they're trying to sell reality, but in a time frame that none of us actually physically saw with our own eyes because we weren't alive at that time. So you're trying to sell the seamlessness of it as well, but we all know that that wasn't actually there. Because of the time frame. So that I feel like that's a little mind-boggling. I watched the first couple episodes, but obviously going to have to run through all these Dr. Death episodes.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Peaky Blinders because, I mean, I'm just outside Birmingham, which is obviously where it's based, although most of it is not shot here. There's a place called the Black Country Museum, which is one of those places that are recreations of that period. So they've got rows of houses and that sort of stuff. So the Black Country Museum is where they shoot some of it, which is also relatively local to me. And the rest of it, a lot of the bigger buildings, they shoot up in Liverpool because Liverpool still has a lot of the old architecture. So that's how they mirror it quite a lot.
Gotcha. I'm looking, it's in Dudley.
Yes, Dudley. It is. Dudley's not that far from Birmingham. That's where they shoot a lot of the Peaky Blinders stuff. And then they use VFX work to match things and mat it all together and stuff.
Right.
I know they shoot some of it there and they shoot some of it in Liverpool as well. And then there's obviously a few other places, but very little of it is shot directly in Birmingham because all the architecture's changed now. So.
Wow. Yeah. Even when I never got to explore kind of like the countryside of England, but when I went to Winchester, that's where I was like, where am I? First of all, but like there's certain pieces of like ancient, it feels ancient, but the architecture and everything feels very real. Whereas here in the States, we haven't been around as long. We have things that emulate that, especially in like Montreal with like old Montreal in Canada, where we try to emulate like ancient or like old architecture, but it still doesn't have like the complete realism when you see like stuff that has actually like the wear and tear on stuff that's been around for so long. Yeah. So I think, man, if Peaky Blinders is actually shooting like real stuff that you guys got over there, kind of help it. Not kind of, but definitely helps and takes away from the amount of visual effects you have to put in prosthetic extensions.
Yeah, so certainly
it does
some of
the job.
Yeah, certainly some of that. So, I mean, my last question is usually if you had the opportunity to work on any TV show, past, present, or future, which show would it be? But I think you've just answered that by saying Peaky Blinders.
No. I think I would have loved to work on The Sopranos for sure. I'm not even a think. Sopranos definitely, without a doubt. My family is like they're a bunch of Italian Americans. So I think if I worked on that show, they would be the most proud ever. But aside from that, The Sopranos, just James Gandolfini, like being around greatness like that in its time, especially with long running series like that on HBO, for the craze of like Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad just being such iconic long running shows. Like I feel like Sopranos was the beginning of all of it, and it was such a twisted telling tale of a mobster and the psychological drama behind it, being Tony Soprano. So and it was shot on film, which is amazing. I love shooting like just 35mm film photography. Yeah. So, and living in this like digital world that, you can shoot as many takes as you want and you just like close down like any like photos that you want. It kind of takes away from the artistic, I think, integrity of how you set up things, because that you could just shoot an unlimited amount of stuff. Whereas I feel like the art form behind film, you only have a certain amount before it's too expensive and whatnot. So it kind of puts everybody in like a more intense process of like, we got to get it right the first time. Or I feel like there was like a mindset change that I didn't get to experience with that. Now, shooting everything 5 or 8K. Yeah. So I don't know. I think that show was phenomenal, and I definitely would have loved to work on it, especially working with people in the industry. It's like, yeah, man, they call back on Sopranos, like Sopranos. Yeah, working on that was like, and then when they instantly say that, I'm like, I love you. Like I was like, tell me more. Like I cannot wait to hear more. But yeah, it's legendary, I'd say. Like especially for working in New York and Jersey people.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a phenomenal series. That I loved that show. So I think that's a really great choice. I shall let you get back to your date. Thank you for spending a little bit of time talking to me. It's been lovely. Hopefully we'll get to chat again at some point in the future.
For sure. Thanks so much, David.
Thanks. Talk to you soon. Cheers. Bye.
All right. Cheers.